The Montpelier brothers' banking hall fell silent as Henry spread his plans across the polished mahogany table. Outside, London's financial district remained in turmoil, but within these walls, a solution was taking shape. If you consolidate these smaller accounts, Henry explained, pointing to his meticulously prepared figures, and publicly announce your support for Harrington Shipping, you'll create a ripple effect. The market needs confidence more than capital right now. Oliver Montpelier studied the documents, his experienced eyes widening with appreciation. Roderick adjusted his spectacles, grudgingly impressed. This analysis is extraordinary, Oliver admitted. Where did you learn such financial acumen? Henry smiled. As a shipping clerk in San Francisco, I balanced ledgers larger than most London banks. I just never had the opportunity to apply my knowledge on this scale. The brothers exchanged meaningful glances. And you've done all this without spending our £1 million. Roderick marveled. I've lost the wager completely. Perhaps, said Oliver thoughtfully, we've all won something more valuable. Later that afternoon, Henry stood beside Todd Harrington on the docks, watching as sailors prepared the merchants' ships for departure, vessels that would now sail thanks to the Montpelier brothers' public endorsement. I still can't believe it, Todd said, shaking his head. Yesterday I faced ruin, and today my business is the cornerstone of London's economic recovery plan. He clapped Henry on the shoulder. And I have you to thank, though I still don't understand why you kept your financial expertise secret all this time. Henry watched the Thames flow past, carrying ships to distant shores. Sometimes the shortest path between 2 points isn't a straight line, he replied. As the day of reckoning approached, the final day of the brothers' wager, London's financial panic began to subside. The consortium Henry had proposed was stabilizing key industries. The £1 million note, still unused, had sparked a financial strategy worth far more than its face value. Henry found Portia waiting for him in Hyde Park, where they had agreed to meet. The afternoon sunlight caught in her hair as she approached, no longer the distant society woman he had first encountered. I saw the papers, she said, her eyes bright with admiration. They're calling it the Adams solution. My father's investments are recovering. I had help, Henry said modestly. From the Montpelier brothers, yes. She took his arm as they walked along the path. They came to call on father this morning. Apparently, they're considering offering a certain American a permanent position. Henry stopped, turning to face her. I've been thinking about that. About staying in London. Have you? Her voice was casual, but her eyes held a question. I have nothing to return to in America, he said. And here? Well, I've found something I never expected. A career in finance? She teased. That too. Henry took both her hands in his. Portia, when you learned the truth about the banknote, about the wager, you could have exposed me to all of London society. And miss seeing how the story ended. Hardly. Her smile softened. Besides, I discovered something important about you, Henry Adams. What's that? That you're exactly the same man, with or without £1 million. She squeezed his hands. Although I must admit, I'm rather fond of what you've done with it. On the final day, Henry returned the £1 million note to the Montpelier brothers' mansion, completing the circuit that had begun 30 days earlier when a desperate American had been pulled from the London streets. By the end of his first week in London, Henry Adams could scarcely recognize his own life. The transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. From the moment Mr. Porter had spread word about the American with the £1 million note, Henry had been swept into a whirlwind of luxury and deference that still felt like a dream. This morning, he awoke in a 4-poster bed at the Savoy Hotel, sunlight streaming through velvet curtains. A week ago, he'd been curled on a wooden bench in Hyde Park. Now, hotel staff practically competed for the honor of bringing his breakfast tray. Your morning newspaper, Mr. Adams, said the attendant, bowing slightly as he placed the Times beside Henry's perfectly prepared eggs, and Mr. Hastings, the hotel manager, wonders if the suite continues to meet your expectations. It's perfectly adequate, Henry replied, still uncomfortable with the fawning attention but learning to accept it with grace. As he scanned the financial pages, he noticed his name mentioned again. American financier Henry Adams was observed in conversation with Lord Abington regarding cotton futures. Henry shook his head in disbelief. He'd merely commented that cotton prices seemed volatile after overhearing a conversation at dinner. His wardrobe now occupied an entire dressing room. The famous tailor Willoughby had outfitted him in the finest suits, refusing payment with the insistence that the honor of dressing Mr. Adams is compensation enough. Henry suspected the man was making a fortune in new customers who wanted to be clothed by the American millionaire's tailor. After breakfast, Henry ventured into the London streets with a confidence that felt increasingly natural. Shopkeepers nodded respectfully, cabbies tipped their hats, and doors opened before he could reach for them. At the entrance to the exclusive Diogenes Club, where he'd somehow become an honorary member, Henry encountered Sir William Barrett, a railway magnate who'd been pursuing him for investment advice. "Adams, just the man. I took your suggestion about consolidating those northern routes." "Brilliant. Simply brilliant." Sir William pumped his hand enthusiastically. "The board thinks I'm a genius." "Glad it worked out," Henry replied modestly, remembering that his suggestion had been nothing more than logical observation based on his clerk experience with shipping manifests, certainly nothing that had required financial genius. Yet the more people projected brilliance onto him, the more Henry found himself rising to meet their expectations. He was developing an eye for opportunities, connections, and inefficiencies in the business world that surrounded him. Without spending a penny of the famous note, he was accumulating something perhaps more valuable: knowledge and social capital. That afternoon, as Henry sat in a leather armchair at the club, sipping brandy he hadn't paid for, he reflected on the absurdity of his situation. The £1,000,000 note remained pristine in a special pocket sewn into his new jacket. Yet its power radiated outward, transforming everything it touched, most notably Henry himself. A messenger approached with a silver tray bearing an invitation. "The Duke of Pembroke requests the pleasure of your company this evening at 8 o'clock. Henry nodded his acceptance, recalling how just 10 days ago he'd been wondering if he might need to steal food to survive. Now he was declining invitations from nobles because his social calendar was too full. As he prepared to return to his hotel to dress for the evening's festivities, Henry caught his reflection in a gilded mirror. The face that looked back was still his own, yet somehow altered, confident, well-fed, respected. "The clothes don't make the man," he murmured to himself, straightening his perfectly tailored lapels. "The story does." And what a story it was becoming. The financial panic gripping London grew worse by the day. Henry watched with growing unease as businesses shuttered their doors and desperate faces multiplied on the streets. His own artificial bubble of prosperity felt increasingly precarious, a gilded cage suspended over a city in turmoil. 3 weeks into his extraordinary month, Henry found himself in Portia's company more frequently. Unlike others, she seemed immune to the allure of his supposed fortune. Today, she had invited him to accompany her to the East End, where her charitable organization distributed food to families affected by the financial crisis. "Unsurprised you accepted my invitation," Portia said as their carriage navigated narrow streets far from the glamour of Mayfair. "This hardly seems the sort of outing that would interest the great Henry Adams." Henry watched her profile against the window, struck by how different she was from the society women who fluttered around him at parties. "Perhaps you don't know my interests as well as you think." Her sharp green eyes assessed him. "Perhaps not." The carriage stopped before a modest building where a line of hollow-cheeked women and children waited patiently. Henry helped Portia down, painfully aware of his fine clothes amid such desperate need. For the next hours, he worked alongside her, distributing bread and soup, listening to stories of lost jobs and dwindling savings. These were the invisible casualties of the financial games played in the city's gleaming offices. Henry's hands grew calloused from carrying heavy pots and sacks of flour, but he refused to stop. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Adams," Portia said as they took a brief rest. "Most men of your position would have fled at the first sign of actual work." "I wasn't born wealthy," Henry replied truthfully, before catching himself. He had nearly revealed too much. Portia's expression softened. "Neither was my father." He built everything from nothing. Her voice faltered. And now, with Middlewich Bank collapsed, Henry wanted desperately to help, to tell her he understood financial hardship more intimately than she could imagine. Instead, he changed the subject. Your friend Baron Fitzroy seemed rather abrupt at the Winthrops' dinner. A flash of pain crossed her face. Fitzroy made it clear that his interest was primarily in my dowry. With that now uncertain, he's discovered pressing business in Scotland. She forced a smile, rather clarifying, don't you think? Henry felt a surge of anger toward the Baron, followed by a wave of guilt. Was he any better, maintaining this charade about his circumstances? Later that evening, as they walked through a small garden near the charity building, Portia stopped suddenly. Why do you never spend it, Henry? The note everyone whispers about. The directness of the question caught him off guard. Is it because it isn't real? She pressed. Or are you not who you claim to be? Henry felt the ground shifting beneath him. In Portia's perceptive gaze, his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. He thought of Todd Harrington, whose shipping business teetered on collapse, a business Henry knew how to save, if only with expertise rather than money. He thought of the Montpelier brothers' wager, with only 9 days remaining. Most of all, he thought of Portia, whose respect meant more to him than all the feigned admiration of London society. The truth is complicated, he finally said. Truth often is. She reached for his hand, her touch warm in the cool evening air. But I find I prefer it to comfortable lies. Henry made his decision then, looking into her eyes. The consequences of honesty might cost him everything he'd gained, but continuing the deception would cost him something far more valuable, the chance at something real in a world of illusions. Portia, there's something I need to tell you about that banknote. Henry stepped out of the Montpelier mansion, his heart pounding against his ribs. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in his inner pocket, as if the paper inside had the physical weight of its astronomical value. £1 million. The sum was beyond comprehension, enough to buy a fleet of ships or a small estate. This is madness, he whispered to himself, glancing nervously at passers-by. Would they somehow sense the fortune he carried? Would thieves materialize from the foggy London streets to relieve him of his burden? He hurried along the cobblestones, wincing as his worn shoes let in dampness from a puddle. The irony wasn't lost on him, carrying a king's ransom while his socks were soaked through. His stomach growled again, reminding him that wealth on paper didn't fill an empty belly. The terms of the wager replayed in his mind. 30 days. He couldn't cash the note. He couldn't tell anyone about the wager. He simply had to survive, somehow, with a piece of currency too large for any reasonable transaction. What have I gotten myself into? Henry muttered, pausing to look at his reflection in a shop window. His face was gaunt from days of near starvation, his once neat hair disheveled. He looked nothing like a man who might reasonably possess £1 million. A well-dressed gentleman bumped into him, then recoiled with distaste at Henry's appearance. Mind yourself, vagrant, the man snapped, brushing his sleeve as if Henry had contaminated it. Henry bit back a retort. If only this pompous fellow knew what lay in his pocket. But that was precisely the problem. How could he convince anyone of his newfound wealth when he looked like he'd been sleeping rough? Which, in fact, he had been. Rain began to fall, light at first, then with increasing intensity. Henry ducked under an awning, watching elegant carriages splash through growing puddles. Just yesterday, he'd been contemplating which bridge might offer the best shelter for the night. Now he held a fortune that he couldn't spend. His thoughts raced. Perhaps he could simply show the note, not to cash it, but to prove he was good for smaller amounts. Would anyone extend credit to a bedraggled American on the strength of such an outlandish denomination? It seemed unlikely. Yet what choice did he have? The Montpelier brothers clearly expected him to fail. This was entertainment for them, a game with a desperate man as their pawn. The thought kindled something in Henry's chest, not just hunger or desperation, but determination. Very well, gentlemen, he said to the absent brothers. I'll play your game. As the rain eased, he spotted a modest restaurant across the street. Through the window, he could see patrons enjoying hot meals, steam rising from their plates. His mouth watered involuntarily. It was time to test the power of the £1,000,000 note. With a deep breath, Henry straightened his posture, attempted to smooth his rumpled jacket, and walked toward the restaurant with all the confidence he could muster. If he was to convince others of his worth, he first needed to convince himself. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and several heads turned to regard the shabby newcomer. The owner approached with obvious suspicion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting the only help Henry needed was directions to the nearest poorhouse. Henry swallowed hard. This was the moment of truth, the beginning of his month-long charade, his dance with deception, his waltz with wealth he didn't possess. "A table for one, please," he said with newfound authority. "I believe you'll find I'm good for it."